On the 15th of August 2021, the Taliban entered Kabul and seized control of Afghanistan as US forces withdrew after 20 years. Against all odds, 5 years later, they still remain in power. The Taliban can claim that, despite international isolation, their rule has survived, ending the nationwide conflict and somewhat improving security across the country. But on the other hand, the authoritarian Islamist regime has largely eliminated political freedoms and women's rights, while the economy remains fragile and humanitarian needs are immense. On the other hand, the resistance from armed opposition is on the rise, creating growing concerns for the regime. This raises a couple of questions. Is Taliban losing control? Even if not, are the foundations of their authority weakening? The first sign of weakness came from a relatively new organization called the Afghanistan United Front, or AUF. It is an armed anti-Taliban resistance group formed to challenge the Taliban's control of Afghanistan through both military operations and a broader political movement. Founded in 2023 and led by Lieutenant General Sami Sadat, the group brings together former Afghan military and intelligence figures, politicians and activists. But Sadat himself is what makes the organization particularly notable. He is a former commander of Afghanistan's Special Operations Corps, previously led the 215th Maiwand Corps in the south, commanded Joint Special Operations Command, and worked in Afghan intelligence. In other words, this is not an inexperienced militia commander. Sadat knows the Taliban, understands Afghanistan's security networks, and has spent years operating alongside Western forces. On the 1st of August 2026, AUF publicly announced a new phase of military operations, claiming attacks across several provinces, including Kandahar, Helmand, Badghis, Ghor, and Faryab. It later claimed further attacks, including a drone strike against an oil facility in Kabul. Out of all the attacks, one location stands out: Kandahar. Kandahar is not simply another Afghan province, but the historic heartland of the Taliban, a predominantly Pashtun region and the home of Supreme Leader Hibatullah Akhundzada. For years, anti-Taliban resistance has been strongest in the north, where the movement has had less traditional support. That makes AUF's operations in Kandahar strategically significant. The message is not necessarily that the group can capture the Taliban's heartland, but the indication that Taliban's traditional strongholds may no longer be completely secure. And that raises a much bigger question. Is AUF simply another armed group fighting for power, or is it trying to challenge the Taliban's entire model of rule? That distinction becomes crucial when we examine what AUF says it actually wants. AUF is not presenting itself simply as another armed group seeking to capture Kabul. Its stated objective is to restore Afghanistan's constitutional order through an inclusive republic with political participation, equality, civil liberties, and a government based on a constitution agreed by the Afghan people. AUF describes its campaign as political, civil, and military, making its challenge to the Taliban broader than an armed insurgency. This creates a fundamental ideological contrast. The Taliban have built an Islamic Emirate centered on concentrated religious and political authority, while AUF says it wants a constitutional republic where power is governed by law and citizens have equal rights. The difference becomes especially clear over women's rights. Under Taliban rule, approximately 2.4 million Afghan girls remain excluded from secondary education, while only around 7% of Afghan women are employed, compared with 84% of men. AUF has made opposition to these restrictions part of its political message. At a women's activism conference in 2025, its leader Sami Sadat declared that Afghan women's freedom is the freedom of our nation, while AUF reaffirmed its commitment to an inclusive republic and women's rights. But this does not mean AUF has already demonstrated that it can deliver this vision, or that it represents the majority of Afghans. What matters is that it is offering a fundamentally different political model. It is not simply asking who should control Afghanistan, it is challenging what Afghanistan's governance and law should look like. Ultimately, that could be more significant than any single battlefield victory. Because if the Taliban's greatest strength is their control of the state, Their greatest vulnerability could be the emergence of a credible alternative to the system they have built. This makes the conflict a battle over Afghanistan's political future, not simply a struggle for territory alone. To make matters worse, AUF isn't the only group that keeps Taliban on their toes. Long before the AUF, National Resistance Front, or the NRF, and also Afghanistan Freedom Front, or AFF, have been challenging Taliban rule since 2021. Between August 2024 and July 2025, the UN verified 277 attacks by armed opposition groups, 165 attributed to the NRF and 55 to the AFF. Despite their notable skirmishes in northern region of Afghanistan, they did not possess control in that region. So the resistance remained a security problem rather than a serious challenge to Taliban territorial control. However, that picture may now be changing. In July 2026, the newly formed group Sepahian-e-Mihan briefly captured the Yaftali Sufla district centre in Badakhshan with around 25 fighters, marking the first reported temporary loss of a district centre since the Taliban returned to power in 2021. The Taliban eventually regained control, but the incident demonstrated that armed groups can still disrupt Taliban administration. At the same time, the Taliban face internal tensions. In Badakhshan, a power struggle has emerged between Juma Khan Fateh, a Tajik Taliban commander, and the central Taliban leadership, with control over local forces and the province's lucrative gold mining industry at the center of the dispute. While this does not indicate a Taliban split, it shows that governing Afghanistan brings competing regional interests and power struggles that did not exist in the same way during their insurgency. Then there is Pakistan. At the heart of the dispute is Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, or TTP, commonly known as the Pakistani Taliban. Islamabad accuses the Afghan Taliban of allowing the group to operate from Afghan territory, while Kabul denies supporting it. The dispute has now escalated into direct military confrontation between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Pakistan has launched repeated airstrikes, while the Taliban have retaliated along the border. This forces Kabul to devote military attention to another front. And finally, there is ISKP, another violent enemy of the Taliban. Unlike other groups, they are ideologically similar to Taliban, but they still represent a major insurgency threat altogether. Despite all these groups aren't united as an opposition, the Taliban are still facing pressure from several directions at once. And the question is whether these separate pressures can eventually begin reinforcing one another. So, is the Taliban losing control of Afghanistan? And the short answer is, not yet. They still control the state and all the major cities, with no sign of territorial losses. The resistance has not yet demonstrated the ability to hold significant territory. But the warning signs are becoming clearer. For years, anti-Taliban resistance was concentrated largely in the north and northeast, allowing the Taliban to view it as a regional or ethnic challenge. AUF has changed that dynamic by taking the fight into Pashtun majority areas, particularly Kandahar. It is expanding the geographical reach of the resistance and sending a different message. Opposition to the Taliban is not simply a northern rebellion or a conflict between ethnic groups. It is an attempt to challenge the Taliban across Afghanistan. The opposition itself, however, remains fragmented. AUF, NRF, AFF and other groups have different leaderships, structures and areas of operation. Surely there are some connections between them. The AUF and NRF have maintained contact, while the AFF also maintained friendly relations with AUF and NRF. But there is still no unified command capable of coordinating the entire resistance. And this is why AUF matters. It may not have the strength to defeat the Taliban alone, but it is expanding the resistance geographically while presenting an alternative political vision based on constitutional government, civil liberties, and women's rights. 5 years after returning to Kabul, the Taliban are not collapsing. But the foundations of their control are facing a more complicated challenge, and AUF may be helping to change the nature of that challenge. Please like and subscribe us for more analysis of latest geopolitical events. Thank you for watching.